Hi, everyone. I am Michael Sustaita. I am a student in the graduate program here at the University of South Alabama in the Clinical and Counseling Psych program. I was invited by Dr. Zigraff to guest lecture today for you, share a little bit about my research because it is related to what is being covered right now in class. I'm going to go ahead and just give a quick introduction to myself. I'm from Houston, Texas. I went to undergraduate at the University of Nebraska at Omaha and completed a bachelor degree there in psychology. Worked in the field for a little bit, working at treatment facilities for substance use problems, working with adolescents in residential facilities, as well as halfway house and other behavioral health settings as well. After that, I decided to go back to school. The Texas Tech University, worked in their clinical psychology program and completed my master's in 2016. After that, I worked in the field a couple more years. I worked in a couple of university hospital settings, helping people, cancer patients, with their health behaviors, and primarily smoking cessation. From there, I moved over to the Baylor College of Medicine and worked on a grant project there after Hurricane Harvey, and that was a nice experience, but decided to go back to school. So here I am at South, and I'm really enjoying it, actually. So I'm going to go ahead and shift, share a little bit about my research and the things that I'm doing, including with Dr. Zigraff as well. So I'm going to figure out how to share everything that I have. Okay. Looks like I finally figured out how to put this on the screen. So I completed a thesis at Texas Tech University, and I'm actually working with Dr. Zigraff now to polish this up and submit it for publication. So I'm going to review broadly my interests. At Texas Tech, I was working in a psychopharmacology lab. My primary interest is substance use. And while I was there, I ended up studying nicotine research quite a bit. And so I'm going to cover various things about it, but primarily I am focused on smoking initiation in this particular study. So I mean, you can see the title of this is a study of the acquired preparedness model, which I'll cover, and examining the effects of impulsivity and motives, but also known as expectancies in this particular study on smoking initiation in college students. So we'll cover what that all means here momentarily. So this was just a brief review of the literature. It wasn't too long ago that the U.S. Surgeon General's report turned 50. Before that, there was really no solid warnings regarding the effects of smoking. So you can see there the Surgeon General's warning, which you may have seen on nicotine products, or particularly tobacco products. And so I'll make some of those distinctions as we go through as well. So despite this general awareness, the serious health risks that are involved, things like, of course, cancer, heart disease, lung disease, and complications to pregnancy, it still remains among the leading causes of death in the U.S. and it's estimated at 480,000 deaths per year, and accounts for about 14% or 1 in 7 deaths annually here in the U.S. So to put that into context, that number is greater than the annual death toll of diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, influenza, suicide, pneumonia, all combined. The deaths from cigarette smoking actually exceeds all of those by 120,000. Or I guess more recently in context, over 100,000 more people than died of COVID in 2020. So, and this is annually. There's been 20 million deaths since the first warning. Again, it remains leading cause, and I just have this little graphic here. You can see the effects and how it affects pretty much your entire body. So nearly 1 in 7 adults are smoking cigarettes currently, and this includes young adults. So I got a little graphic here. And high school smokers are more likely to become heavy smokers later in life. So I think that this is an important area to examine. When we talk about 1 in 7 adult smokers, that actually totals about 34 million adult smokers in the US. And it's relatively the same percentage worldwide, which accounts for 1.1 billion smokers. And although cigarette use among adolescents has been declining over the past 15 years, maybe even 20 years at this point, it's still estimated that 1,600 minors begin smoking in the US every day, and 200 of those will become daily smokers. And further, despite a decline in cigarette smoking initiation among adolescents, nicotine use is actually on the rise. It's steadily on the rise. And we were seeing declines in cigarette smoking among youth because of vaping and e-cigarettes. But it's just really that the decline is being accounted for by vaping. So now we have nicotine use almost at an all-time high at 24% of high school students using some sort of nicotine product. And even a real recent study actually just came out end of last year. It's showing that there's a shift going on where a lot of high school students were the primary initiators of smoking. But now it's actually moving to young adults, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But this is another important reason to look at this particular population, because not only is it the highest rates now of initiation, but it's also been identified as the peak of nicotine abuse, that period of time. And another reason you would want to look at this population is because young adults, if they decided to quit smoking, they actually have the highest quit rates, that rather than older adults who are about 66% of them can quit, but 84% of young adults are able to quit. So basically the earliest intervention, just like many things you hear health-wise, is going to have the best effect. And we can talk a little bit more about those reasons as well. A lot of young adults initiate smoking as kind of a social or experimental thing in the sort of early adulthood, college age, but also, young adults who are not in college actually have higher smoking rates than college students. So it can be argued that examining this age group may provide the greatest insight into uniquely relevant or prepotent factors associated with smoking initiation. And that also goes for maintenance and can inform cessation treatment, which is just a fancy word for saying to quit smoking. Yeah, and also quit rates are also one of the things you always want to look at is the stay quit rate, which is has the person quit for at least 6 months. Once you hit that 6-month mark, you're much more likely to have that stick than having restarted before. So there have been different models applied to substance use and initiation. And for a long time, it was pretty much basic learning models. And these could just be generally described as change in behavior as a result of your experiences. So I want to do a quick refresher on what operant conditioning is. You may have probably already covered this, but in terms of putting it in the context of substance use, I think it would be helpful to cover this real quickly. So in operant conditioning, or another way of saying learning, you have your reinforcers, which is your rewards, which we're probably familiar with. And we have different kinds of reinforcers. We have a positive reinforcement, which basically means that when something is presented, that response following like whatever has been added to the situation or whatever the stimulus is, then you get your reinforcer, your reward. So I do this thing, and this positive thing is in front of me, and then I get this reward. Negative reinforcement is a little bit different in that it's actually removing something unpleasant that's already in place. So in other words, it makes your situation better by removing something that's kind of negative that you're experiencing already. And then punishment is different. So sometimes negative reinforcement gets confused with punishment, but actually punishment is just something negative that occurs, which ends up decreasing the probability that that response is going to occur. So if you do something and something bad happens, you're less likely to repeat that behavior, hopefully. I also wanted to cover extinction. That's pretty important regarding substance use, especially how difficult it is. Almost all of the quit rates for substances in general are pretty poor. But in terms of extinction and how that's relevant to substance use, the response is no longer reinforced. So this is interesting, and I'll talk about that in a moment, because extinction is essentially cessation. And timing is also important. You may have already heard, or maybe you know this because you have a pet, that the sooner the consequence of the action that occurs, the greater effect you're going to have. It's just it's just basic temporal association that's going on there. So here I have basically the same slide, but I just kind of wanted to give some context again. So for positive reinforcement, when you're using the drug, that reward, the presentation of that reward, in the example of tobacco use or nicotine use rather, is it's a stimulant. So people get pleasure from a stimulant, and if you are a coffee drinker or a caffeine addict, you would know what that is like. Of course, there are other substances that are stimulants as well. So using drugs in terms of negative reinforcement, it is actually an anxiolytic, which again is a fancy word for easing anxiety or reducing it. and sort of facilitates calmness, which a lot of people need. So it's a very interesting drug in that your body responds to it in different ways. It's kind of unique in that way. To be something that can reduce anxiety and stimulate you is a little bit different. There's a sequence to it, but we don't, for the purposes of this, the pharmacology portion is not as important because we're focusing more on the psychological component of this. But in terms of punishment, using that drug, it causes impairment, and might put you in a state that you enjoy. But one of the things that is important to think about when you're comparing drugs is when you use that drug, how hard does it hit you? So, for example, you might be able to smoke several times a day, take smoke breaks at work and so forth, and it doesn't really affect the way that you might work. In some cases, it's going to keep people a little less irritable depending on how dependent they are. So the impairment is very different. Drinking alcohol on the job is going to be a lot different for someone who's maybe driving a train or something. And so that is something that you can think about when you're talking about the differences between something like nicotine or even caffeine. If you think about it, caffeine is one of those things that most widely used psychoactive drug on the planet, and you can use it, you can drink it all day, every day. You might have heart problems in the future, but in terms of daily functioning, you're probably safe on that. You could overdose. So this is important to know because, like, say, for example, you get drunk and then you end up having a hangover the next day. That is kind of a punishment or a consequence. Whereas with nicotine usage, as long as you're continuing to use that substance, which is not really directly affecting or it's not really impairing you from daily functioning, then it's a kind of drug that you can use all the time, which means that you're more likely to not only become addicted to it, but also be able to continue functioning while using it. In terms of extinction, in relation to tobacco use, or really just drug use in general, you've got this physiological tolerance that you're going to build for some substances, for quite a few substances actually. But you will find that nicotine users, they're not going to get the same effect from the first few times that they try it, and so they will have to continue using more and more over time in order to get the same effect, which, of course, if you're using the substance more frequently and greater amounts, then it's going to take a greater toll on your health. And then, you can see that with alcohol usage, it's pretty clear how damaging it can be. So it is about exposure, and it is about the potency of the drug itself. Timing. So when you're smoking a drug, it's practically immediate. There are different delivery rates for different, ways of, taking in the substance itself. Drinking something takes a little longer. Eating something takes even longer. Intravenous is, or IV, or shooting up. That's goes directly to your heart, so that's pretty quick. But smoking is a close second. So again, this is important because if you're getting the effect immediately, then you're gonna seek it out to pacify your craving or whatever kind of effect you're hoping to get out of the drug. It's going to be the most immediate way to relieve the user. Also, schedules of reinforcement is important. So in this case, continuous reinforcement is typically how substance use works, with the exception of developing tolerance over time. So you may have to increase the dosage, but you're still going to get the effect if you're able to do that. Of course, it gets dangerous as you get to the point where taking in so much of the substance actually becomes toxic, or you can become overdose on that as well. So again, the response is always reinforced in a continuous reinforcement situation versus an intermittent reinforcement, which you may have learned about in learning or behaviorism already. So in general, these principles of learning, they're theorized to collectively contribute to the development of causal associations that can function to yield a desired outcome. So essentially, that's the learning model of how substance use is initiated. And when I say initiation, I'm talking about, you know, you're starting to use the drug on a routine basis, rather than just experimenting. Or in nicotine research, they also have a term called chippers, or people who smoke less than 5 cigarettes a day, or they only smoke when they drink, or only smoke socially, like maybe once a week or something like that. In the context of substance use and abuse, the associations may be psychological, but also physiological. So this is something that kind of separates a substance use disorder within the mental health field from other disorders, in that literally have a physical addiction to a substance, which means if you're going to treat this, or you can try to intervene, kind of develop some kind of intervention, you actually have to consider the psychological component and the physiological component. So here, when we're talking about the psychological component, you can see that there are different needs that are being met, that are really like cognitive. You know, you're thinking about how a cigarette or nicotine can either serve some sort of purpose, because that's the basis of behavior in the first place. It's like, well, this serves some sort of function, which again is a function of the learning model as well. But in terms of the physiological component, you can see here that the way that the actual drug affects the body, which of course affects the body, and then it affects the mind. So so you can see here how this works, where the person who's smoking the cigarette, that, you know, nicotine ends up reaching the brain, which in terms of our brain, the kind of receptors that we have for nicotine use, those are they're pretty powerful, meaning that when you begin using nicotine, the earlier you use it, you know, you're developing as a person, you're going to end up developing more and more of these receptors during your development. And the problem with that is these receptors become really active, which means that you're going to start craving the drug. And it is actually neck and neck with opiates. Some people think, oh, cigarette smoking, you know, cigarettes are something I can buy, but opiates, well, you can buy opiates too, but they're illicit substances, and generally people do not make that comparison, that opiates are as dangerous as cigarettes, but in the sense, it's just like, give it time. So when that nicotine reaches the brain, then you have this dopamine release, which is that pleasure component that I was talking about. So kind of, you get that rush, you know, it's a stimulating feeling, but then the nicotine level decreases a bit in the brain. You get those receptors sucking up all of that that chemical, and then you end up getting this pleasant rush that dissipates. So again, it gives you that calm, relaxing feeling. And but then, you know, of course, that leads once that chemical dissipates in the brain, then you begin craving more of it. So then you can have to smoke. So there's your cycle, your or physiological cycle. There are other ways people have tried to explain substance use initiation, looking at personality theory. So we're going to briefly cover personality theory and as it relates to substance use. So just as a reminder, personality, this characteristic sets of behavioral, cognitive, and emotional patterns that evolve from biological, or also like to call it genetic, and environmental factors. And you have to keep in mind that, as I mentioned before, when you're talking about biological factors and environmental factors, if you're happen to be in a situation where you start using a substance early, that can have an interaction between your genetics and you know, what's going on with your own biology. So there's an effect there to keep in mind. So personality has been considered to be relatively stable over the lifespan. Some of you can look really into the research, but this is a broad general statement about personality. So, for example, in the mental health field, when you're talking about personality disorders versus other, you know, diagnoses or mental health disorders, you are okay. So you're seeing consistency over the lifespan regarding these personality factors. So what's going on here? Okay, there we go. So you probably also covered the big 5 personality traits. Trait theory kind of uses this model, this model was kind of born out of that, to look at these various traits. Some people call it ocean. You can see there on the little graphic there, it says openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So take that acronym, it's ocean. So these are pretty consistent in terms of you know, considerations for factors of personality. And so there's oftentimes people have this notion that there's an addictive personality, and so it has been researched extensively. Actually, a lot of attention and money has been put into this idea. And it's basically hypothesizes that there's a set personality traits. So essentially what they're saying is that there's some sort of combination of these factors of personality that you can see here that makes someone predisposed to developing an addiction. And the kind of work that's being done is definitely valuable. But it definitely, there's controversy and criticism regarding this type of theory, because when you look at the research, there is very, very specific combinations that have been associated with various different types of substances, and so it's not what you would call a parsimonious model where it's using sort of a basic understanding to be able to apply to substance use. So it has its limitations, but through the research itself, you do have strong evidence for these additional facets of personality that have been applied to this kind of work, specifically impulsivity and sensation seeking. And if you look at the research now, you're seeing impulsivity as a component of substance use, initiation, consistently. So um, basically, I'm going to kind of focus on that personality trait specifically. Um, and so what I did is I started looking at, well, is there an explanation that actually accounts for these two broad theories? And there is. The acquired preparedness model actually accounts for these two factors. So you're looking at not only learning, but also personality as well. So personality really being somewhat limited to a trait of impulsivity. But it is important to note that impulsivity itself is a pretty dynamic. It has multiple facets to it, and we'll cover those momentarily. But um, essentially, the trait itself kind of maps onto the big five in a way. So, and there's pretty good evidence for that in terms of the factors that are comprise the trait of impulsivity in the literature. Learning factor, of course, this is the most traditional model, and you look at the research. This has been looked at for 70, 80 years minimum. If you're thinking about long established kind of theories of substance use. So here, again, it is incorporating personality as well as learning to sort of explain these behaviors. So essentially the acquired preparedness model, I might refer to it as APM going forward. It posits that personality, or specifically in this case, we're looking at impulsivity, it leads to selective attention to reward-related information. So in other words, a personality, there's this bias that you would find in people with higher levels of impulsivity that influences an individual's outcome expectancies. So in other words, the learning component is actually a unique experience for the individual, because you're talking about people who have this trait and also have this learning experience. So it is different for really everyone. But if you're looking at different facets of this trait, and then various behaviors evolving around various risk behaviors, then you're actually seeing a little more continuity than some of the something like the addictive personality theory. So essentially, this is explaining that personality in conjunction with learning can lead to these health risk behaviors. Now, this model is it's gaining more and more attention. It has been used in alcohol research, as well as marijuana use, cannabis, eating behaviors as well. So sometimes that gets overlooked as a health behavior, but it's really at this point is pretty much tied with smoking at this point for the number of total attributable deaths because of negative health outcomes that are relative to poor eating behaviors and gambling. So again, another thing that kind of gets overlooked in regard to addiction. Some people say that gambling is actually the purest form of addiction, because it actually does not have that physiological component of the substance itself. Whereas, looking at alcohol, cannabis, even eating, that's releasing different levels of dopamine and so forth. Whereas gambling, yeah, you're getting that, but it's not by consuming anything. So that's kind of interesting. And then of course tobacco use, and this is relatively a new area for tobacco use or nicotine research. So I wanted to talk a little bit about expectancy theory. So expectancy theory is actually, it's defined as this anticipatory predictions of effects of consequences of actions taken by the individual itself. So in other words, this is learning. This is essentially the associations that you make, and you end up predicting some sort of outcome based on behavior that you've already engaged in, that has, you've learned that this association is true. And so based on the theories, these summaries, defined as expectancies, are reflective of the individual's learning history, and that informs the action of the desired outcome. And that's critical for basic functioning of all organisms. We really cannot think about every single thing that we do. There's just so much information coming in that you have to be able to filter it and use heuristics, essentially another fancy word for just mental shortcuts that are associations. And we rely on those. And you may have learned that in some sort of cognitive portion of psychology already, in terms of how, really, again, how critical these things are. And in the case of substance use, it's theorized that the experience of using a substance will define the temporal relationship between the drug use behavior and the consequent psychophysiological effects. I mean, you're kind of combining those two facets of outcomes. So, and subsequently, the resulting association or expectancy, it can provide the individual a basis for predictive decision making for the desired outcome. So in the area of substance use, this typically presents as a positive reinforcement, so some sort of pleasure, or negative reinforcement, so avoiding like some type of pain or unpleasantness in some way. So really the first application that I have seen of the acquired preparedness model regarding nicotine use was a study done in 2013 by Doran and colleagues. Doran did look at impulsivity. He wanted to apply basically a new measure of impulsivity to better explain the process as it relates to the acquired preparedness model. So again, with impulsivity, I had kind of mentioned it's kind of broad in terms of it being kind of a global trait in a way, because people are not just scoring high on various ways in which impulsivity can present itself, but low as well, right? So there are various combinations of those that can sort of predict different behaviors, really. So he basically paired, or he mapped, sometimes we just say he mapped on the impulsivity trait as a component, a personality component. And in terms of learning, kind of already discussed that expectancies are essentially learning. And so in this way, he's predicted that, in terms of the health risk behavior, we're looking at smoking initiation. So this is the basic model as it has been applied to nicotine research so far. Now, in terms of what Doran and colleagues found, when you're looking at impulsivity, this is a good place to kind of review the different facets. So In terms of impulsivity, he used a measure called the UPS, the UPPS, and these different letters of the acronym stand for these different facets. So kind of touched on sensation seeking earlier, and I just mentioned it, but sensation seeking, as you can imagine, is wanting to seek out some sort of, whether it be pleasure or just a feeling. And there, you may know someone like this. You may be one of these people who is looking for either a thrill or pleasure, and they may score higher on something like that if they're maybe they're a daredevil, maybe they love roller coasters or hang gliding or something like that, and they seek out those experiences or opportunities. Negative urgency is pretty different. Negative urgency, in that case, you have a sense of urgency because that you're feeling some sort of negative or unpleasantness in general, and when you use a substance, you may be able to relieve that. So negative urgency, how quickly or how likely are you going to act on something in order to relieve some sort of pain or unpleasantness? Lack of perseverance, that's kind of self-explanatory. Someone impulsively just sort of giving up on something, they have little patience for something, so they're just not willing to stick with something because, again, perhaps it may be troublesome for them or unpleasant or difficult in some way, so they just don't stick with it. And lack of premeditation. So are you thoughtful? Are you strategic? Are you planning for things, or are you not? Are you just kind of going for it and going with it and not really being so concerned about what the potential consequences could be? So you can see how these are all kind of, well, directly related to impulsivity, but yeah, so that's the personality component. And then, as I had mentioned, the expectancies component is really the learning component. And in this case, Dorn used a measure to identify positive reinforcement, which we talked about, negative reinforcement, and then negative consequences. So you can just think of that as punishment. So here on this graphic here, I've sort of used the color coding to identify what these factors are and how they're related to each other. And so what you're going to find here is that Dorn found some associations here. He found that a sensation seeking was actually directly related to smoking initiation. It wasn't true for negative urgency directly on smoking initiation, but what you can see is that people are scoring high on negative urgency if they're actually high on this learning experience of negative reinforcement. Then, which again, remember, negative reinforcement is taking something negative away, then they are more likely to initiate smoking, which, right, logically that makes sense. You are wanting to get rid of something unpleasant. You have identified that there's something unpleasant, then you'll go ahead and use that substance to relieve that. And similarly, in addition to this direct effect of sensation seeking on smoking initiation, you also have this premeditation. So you're looking at, I'm sorry, not not premeditation, but positive reinforcement. I get these acronyms mixed up a little bit. But yeah, I knew that didn't sound right. Positive reinforcement. So, right, this also makes sense. If someone is sensation seeking and they're getting some sort of positive reinforcement, or there's something positive is being added to the situation by engaging in the behavior, then yeah, you might as well smoke in order to get that. I'm not endorsing smoking, just for the sake of explaining. So the thing is there actually has been an update to that measure of impulsivity, and so what was added, some of the research and literature is actually indicating that negative urgency is a thing, but positive urgency is also a thing. In general, people are just looking at urgency, and typically a lot of people were saying, oh, well, urgency is just always kind of associated with this negativity, but that's not true. Positive urgency means that, hey, I really, really want something positive to happen right now. Which, how is that different from sensation seeking? Well, sensation seeking is a little more broad, whereas positive urgency would be more like, there is a situation and I want to take advantage of it right now. Like this, I'm very intentional about this. Whereas sensation seeking is more like, yeah, I'm kind of always looking for a thrill or some sort of positive effect of doing something. So something I wanted to look at with positive urgency, and Doran and colleagues did not look at that, and I imagine it was just because they did not have access to the measure, or I mean, some of this research sometimes is done a while ago, and when measures are updated, you just don't have access to them before you're able to publish after gathering your data. But anyway, I did want to look at impulsivity and kind of see if not only we could replicate Doran's results, but also see if positive urgency can also partially explain the personality component of smoking initiation in this model. Expectancies as a measure of learning. So Doran used that, and I wanted to as well. But the thing is I wanted to look at something with a little more specific. So as you could see, Doran was using positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and then negative consequences. We didn't find any results, or didn't find anything significant when he was looking at punishment. So I didn't worry about that. I didn't look at that. But in terms of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, we could get a little more specific with that. And so I was able to find this measure called the tobacco motives inventory. And even though it's labeled motives, it's actually, and when you look at the measure itself, it's expectancies as they're defined. So, and it's a 4-factor measure rather than, well, I guess in Doran's case, it would have been a 3-factor measure because you're including that punishment component. But in terms of what he found, that was really only 2 factors that he was working with. And so with the 4-factor measure, I was able to actually map on these more specific behaviors. And again, just to kind of reiterate that an expectancy is basically this association that if I do this, I will feel this way. So it's kind of this condition. So again, I kind of use the TMI, or the tobacco motives inventory, as a measure of expectancies to explain smoking initiation. So I developed these research questions based on these, these, I guess, different ways of looking at it, and kind of, rethinking the test model, I guess, of this, or how we're going to answer any questions. And so I wanted to say, well, okay, is positive urgency a contributor to smoking initiation in college students within this framework, the APM framework? And does a 4-factor measure of expectancies, does it serve as a consistent measure of learning in support of the APM of smoking initiation in college students? In other words, does this measure map on to the 2-factor model? And are we going to get consistent results that Doran and colleagues got? And then, can a 4-factor measure of expectancies, can it serve to provide a greater dimensional specificity of smoking initiation than a 2-factor measure in college students? So, in other words, can I learn more about what positive reinforcement and what negative reinforcement looks like in relation to these facets of impulsivity? And so, I guess broadly my study, it sought to examine whether the relation between facets of impulsivity and smoking initiation can at least partially be explained by a 4-factor measure of expectancies to smoke as it relates to the acquired preparedness model in college students. So my study design, I was able to recruit 305 college students, and predominantly female and Caucasian. Most of them, 80.3%, reported that they had never smoked, and 19.7% were categorized as smoking initiators. So in other words, they reported initiating smoking within the past 2 years. The initiation period is kind of, it looks a little different in the literature, and that I've seen anything from between a year and 2 years. So I wanted to be a little more conservative with this in terms of looking at personality traits as more of a developmental, more of a dynamic factor, as young adults are still sort of developing that prefrontal cortex, which allows them to think more about or foresight and potential consequences of actions and so forth. So you're still in that age range where in a sense your impulsivity trait is a little more malleable, not a crazy amount, but as a, like, let's say a 12-year-old, but still there's still some differences you definitely see, things you can notice in the college population. You probably know about those things. So survey measures, again, I use the TMI and modeling derived from the results of Doran et al. I just basically mapped on these various factors of the TMI that I'll cover that in just a moment. And then I use the UPS, but I use the updated version, which is the UPS P, the P standing for positive urgency. My study also included a demographic questionnaire. I kind of wanted to account or control for some of the various, I guess, variables that would contribute to smoking. I wanted to be able to control for those. So that was really also to obtain whether or not someone, their smoking status and the time of initiating smoking as well. Not sure why that went in reverse order, but this gives me an opportunity to talk about the ways in which the TMI differed from what Doran was using. So again, he was looking at positive reinforcement expectancies, but in the TMI, I was able to map social motives or self-enhancement motives as basically those things. So this is, again, just a little more specific in that positive reinforcement, you got that social motives, you're basically in a social situation. And you want to enjoy yourself and have fun and just add to that experience. So that's what you do. And then self-enhancement, right? So you're feeling good and you just want to enhance that experience. So just why a lot of people who smoke, they really just smoke when they drink, because it kind of makes that experience even better. The negative reinforcement, again, you're trying to remove something negative or unpleasant from the situation by engaging in the behavior. So boredom relief, yeah, boredom relief for a long time. It's not, you don't want the boredom, so you would engage in this thing to get rid of it, and the affect regulation as well. So that's pretty evident, right? Like if you're feeling down, or let's say you're feeling anxious, that's probably more appropriate for this. If you have that anxiolytic effect, then that will probably resolve it, at least for a short period of time. So I had a data analytic plan. My pre-analysis, I just did multiple imputation method for any missing data, which was very low, it was less than 1%. Used Pearson correlation analysis and dummy coded the linear regression to detect covariates, which I kind of mentioned before. I wanted to be able to account for those control form. Confirmatory factor analysis, I did that to compare the tobacco motives inventory to Doran's measure, looking at the reinforcements. And I basically found that the TMI, or the four-factor model, actually fit a little bit better to the data, but in reality it was about the same. So it was not any worse. So it definitely was a good argument to be able to use that as a measure of expectancies. Yeah, I just wanted to use it as a more appropriate factors, including the initiation model itself. So the main analysis was mediation modeling, and I used the SPSS process macro by Hayes for that. And I bias corrected bootstrapping with 5,000 iterations because, again, you saw that my smoking population was about, well, 20%, which it's about on par with, at least at the time, smoking demographics. So I had to sort of account for that disparity, and to test those hypotheses, including the indirect effects, of course. So I had to use multiple models. If I had more smokers, I probably could have done a comprehensive model, but in terms of being able to look at the different hypotheses that I had, it was acceptable to go ahead and use multiple models. So my first hypothesis was that social motives will mediate the relationship between positive urgency and smoking initiation. So again, social motives being, basically like a party situation or hanging out with friends and so forth, or even new friends. Positive urgency, this is, again, that new facet of impulsivity. Hey, this is a good opportunity for me to have an even better time. So let me go ahead and engage in some smoking initiation. So again, you can see here my social motives. I color coded this in purple to kind of demonstrate that this is the expectancy factor. And then the orange, you've got your personality factor here, or impulsivity. And then blue is my outcome, or my dependent variable, which is smoking initiation. So I found that there was actually this this relationship between positive urgency, social motives, and smoking initiation here. So that hypothesis is what actually supported. My second hypothesis was to look at self-enhancement motives. Again, one of those factors of positive reinforcement, and will that mediate the relationship between positive urgency, again, this facet of impulsivity, and the outcome of smoking initiation? And I did not find support for that. You can see there with the association, the correlation there. I could theorize about why this looks different. Maybe it's interference of learning experiences by decades of anti-tobacco campaigning. So in other words, kind of realizing or having this foresight. Again, this is not premeditation. So positive urgency, if you're being intentional about this, then maybe you know that smoking in terms of being able to provide that experience is just not beneficial enough to engage in that behavior. So this was actually very interesting because with Doran's results, you're seeing that positive reinforcement, it has this relationship with smoking initiation, but when you're looking at this particular facet, you're not seeing a consistent relationship if you're looking at positive reinforcement with these two factors of social motives and self-enhancement. So in the second model, I looked at negative urgencies, right? So that was something that Doran had found. So again, I have this purple looking at the expectancies here of affect regulation motives. And I've got negative urgency as my facet of personality, or rather impulsivity. And of course, looking at smoking initiation as my dependent variable. I found this relationship between negative urgency and smoking initiation by way of affect regulation motives. Not surprising, really, right? So negative urgency, I need to get rid of this negative feeling. And so having affect regulation as an expectancy, I know that smoking is going to provide this this relief for me. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that hypothesis was supported. And if we're looking at boredom relief, the other negative reinforcement expectancy in relation to negative urgency, and seeing what kind of outcome you get here, it wasn't supported. I did not find a relationship there. Again, very interesting because this would kind of identify
the time is 6:36 a.m. Currently in Mobile, it's 61 degrees with fog. Today, it'll be partly cloudy with a forecasted high of 81 and a low of 61.
Bitch, shut up.
There are 7 entries.
Hey Google,
today.
stop
Here are the
talking.
first 3.
Hey Google, hey Google, hey Google, stop talking.
Here's the latest news.
Shut up.
From Reuters TV, US at 6:17 a.m. today. From CNN News Briefing.
Oh, you gotta be kidding me. So that looked a little bit different than Thorne's overall factor. In terms of this hypothesis really not being supported, my best guess here was that, there we go, that there's this pervasive use of mobile technology among young adults to relieve boredom. I think relieving boredom, I mean, you can look around anywhere and see that people are on their smartphones all the time looking social media and so forth. So turning to a cigarette, it's just not as convenient as using your smartphone in so many different ways. And frankly, it's probably just more stimulating in terms of relieving boredom itself because you're mentally engaged in this behavior. So I think boredom motives is a little bit dated. And so we may not see that so much as previous literature kind of showed that. Also, the motive itself may be more salient to well-established associations. So, in other words, the expectancy of this is just not the same. People are just not having the same sort of idea that this is going to relieve my boredom, at least as an alternative to using a smartphone. These are just ideas, in terms of explaining why these hypotheses may not have worked out. In this situation, my third model, my fifth hypothesis was looking at sensation seeking in relation to smoking initiation. Directly, it was not supported. So that was kind of interesting because it did look a little bit different in terms of thinking about how impulsivity or sensation seeking specifically, it really didn't correlate, which was interesting. Maybe it just had to do with the initiation period itself. It just wasn't long enough, perhaps, or there were some sample differences, perhaps, as well. In terms of my sixth hypothesis, I was looking at social motives, whether or not that was mediating the relationship between sensation seeking and smoking initiation. So even if there wasn't a direct relationship, was it mediated? Not supported. So again, not totally sure. Just in terms of an educated guess here, maybe there's a distal relation due to poor translation of expectancy to a particular motive. And then my final hypothesis was that self-enhancement motives would mediate the relation between sensation seeking and smoking initiation. So again, looking at self-enhancement as your learning variable, you got sensation seeking as your personality variable of impulsivity, and looking at smoking cessation, again, it was not supported here. So in no way did I find a relationship between sensation seeking and smoking initiation directly or by way of these learning expectancies. Kind of interesting. So motive may actually be more salient to well-established associations, which is kind of what I was getting at before. In other words, there just isn't a strong enough association to support maybe that kind of relationship. Maybe it's something that you would see more so in more daily routine smokers or people who have been smoking for a little while. Maybe they're a little more physically dependent on the substance itself. The implications of these findings, so positive urgency actually may contribute to smoking initiation in college students, at least as it relates to the acquired preparedness model. So that was kind of a whole new finding, which again, it can explain some variance in terms of the smoking initiation process. And then social expectancies actually may be more impactful for individuals expressing higher measures of positive urgency in smoking initiation of college students. So that's really important, right? Because well, college students are doing a lot of experimenting, and they're meeting a lot of new people and engaging in a lot more social activities, perhaps than in high school, or at least for a good number of students. And then affect reactivation motives may be more impactful for individuals expressing higher measures of negative urgency in smoking initiation of college students. So in other words, wanting to be able to modulate your affect, meaning kind of maybe a negative experience, or just again general unpleasantness, that if people are having higher negative urgency, like they really need to get rid of that feeling, then that actually may be a big contributor. So again, those were associated with the hypotheses that were supported. In terms of implications for the study, kind of concluded that maybe a 4-factor measure of expectancies may actually serve as a more appropriate measure of learning in the acquired preparedness model, the smoking initiation of these college students, than Doran's measure of looking at just positive and negative reinforcement as well as punishment. Also concluding that a four-factor measure of expectancies may serve to provide greater dimensional specificity for smoking initiation and expectancies in college students. So in other words, using this measure can just give us a little more insight into what kind of situations would apply to these broad domains of negative and positive reinforcement. And then identifying specific configurations of facets of impulsivity and smoking expectancies actually could help identify better targets for early intervention efforts, such as focusing on predisposition in conjunction with particular context. So specifically, I'm thinking about social motives, you know, in a college setting. So that would be something to consider when you're looking at, you know, I guess different relationships in terms of mediators. And so there were some limitations to the study, of course. So I was using cross-sectional design. I love to use, you know, experimental design, but in terms of access to data, this is what was available for me to get. So in a way, I was actually trying to look at this as a retrospective sort of study. In other words, you're telling me about previous behavior, and then because I'm using personality or impulsivity as a measure of personality, again, if it's a more stable trait and individuals are developing and actually becoming less impulsive over time because of, you know, again, developing that prefrontal cortex, then it's actually kind of a conservative measure. So it may actually be a little bit better in terms of being able to measure that. I used a college sample. Using a more generalized sample would have been ideal. There are a lot of smoking initiators who are not in college, and that would have been helpful in order to make a better generalization. I did not control for dependence, so that would be something that would be helpful in terms of kind of accounting more so for the that physical dependence, or that physiological component of smoking. Single measure of variable. So if you've learned about research methods, you may know that using multiple measures to measure some kind of variable it'll give you more, basically more data to be able to compare and just kind of give you a little more support in terms of being a little more confident in the fact that you're measuring what you're proposing to measure. So in terms of future directions, of course, I would love to look at this longitudinal study and kind of get multiple time points rather than use this cross-sectional design. And, you know, it is limited in terms of, I mean, right, if you've already learned that correlation is not causation, I can argue for temporal kind of process, but longitudinal would be a definite. College sample, again, I would love to use a more diverse young adult sample. Controlling for dependence, that would be helpful, I think, in terms of learning for expectancies. And then single measure, because using multiple measures of these variables, kind of identified a couple of measures that might be helpful in looking at this type of thing again, or continuing the research itself, and including that expectancy measure, or an additional one rather. And just better define initiation. As you know, there's pretty much, there's a lot of inconsistency in terms of how that is defined. And so ideally I would, in doing a longitudinal design, I'd actually have the benefit of being able to make an argument for really any level of time as the initiation period. And of course, how does vaping differ, right? Vaping it's here, it's no longer the future. I remember doing nicotine research when vaping was just kind of, I wouldn't say getting off the ground, but it was becoming a little more prevalent. But it's in full force now. And so, this is tobacco research, right? But vaping is nicotine, right? I mean, it's a tobacco derivative, but in terms of the health consequences, it looks like vaping is not as dangerous. I need to be very careful about that statement because one, we still don't know the long-term effects of vaping. As we are learning more, we're finding that it's not healthy and it's kind of dangerous. So again, it's another interesting thing because if people are thinking that it's safe, maybe they're actually using vaping a lot more than smoking cigarettes. So that is something to consider as well. So I just want to thank my colleagues here, former mentor and lab mates and people who've been able to help me with this process. Definitely want to thank Dr. Zikraff for giving me this opportunity to present my research and to guest lecture. Really enjoyed that, and that's it. So I guess being a recording, you can't really ask me questions directly, but feel free to email me if you have any interest in this topic at all, or just substance use in general. I'm also very interested in youth and adolescent development in relation to mental health issues and concerns, and especially comorbidity or dual diagnosis situations that include substance use. So I guess with that, thank you and have a great week.